Hello, welcome to another episode of Technology Philosophy. Today I would like to give an account of Simondon's theory of individuation. Simondon, theory of trans-individuation, individual and collective. Gilbert Simondon lived 1924 to 1989 and has one of the most respected theories of individuation. Individuation typically refers to the process of formation into distinct entities like human beings. Simondon means individuation in this way too, however, importantly, further understands individuation to be an ongoing process that is never complete. He invokes the concept of metastability to denote a temporary moment of stability that is fragile and susceptible to changing conditions. There are different kinds of individuations. First, at the metaphysical level, there is a biological individuation into a living being. The living being then maintains its existence throughout its life through a series of continuing individuations. Prior to individuation, a being has pre-individual potential, which is essentially energy available for individuation. The idea of pre-individual potential comes from the pre-Socratic definition of nature as the reality of the possible. Nature is apeiron, infinite pre-individual potential that is not yet a phase of being. Following an individuation, a being is comprised of individuation, the aggregation of all previous individuations, plus the remainder of non-individuated pre-individual potential that is never fully incorporated and always ready for subsequent individuations. The being is metastable, ready for change. After the biological or physical individuation, two individuations occur that are in reciprocal relationship with each other. One interior to the individual, called the psychic individuation, and the other exterior to the individual, called the collective individuation. Individuation always creates both an individual and a collective subject which individuate themselves together, an inside part and an outside part. Through these individuations, the living being becomes a subject. The subject is a result of the process of individuation. The subject is an effect, not a cause. This is different from many other theories of individuation in that here the individuated subject arises as a result of the individuation process, not as the instigator. Already we start to see Simondon's systemic view of reality, where the subject is just one element, not the center. The reciprocal relationship of the psychic and collective individuations that occur in the transformation of the living being to subject is called the trans-individual relation. Psychic individuation, emotion and perception. The internal dimension of individuation is psychic individuation, which is composed of individuations of emotion and perception. For Simondon, perception is defined as an act of individuation operated by a living being to resolve a conflict with its milieu. The relation between subject and world is a system in tension, where the subject's role is only one part of the ensemble. A living being is continually facing incompatibility problems with its environment, such as discomfort, hunger, and emotion. The compatibilization of the living being to the milieu includes both somatic, physical, and psychic, mental aspects. Perception is a process where the subject invents a form, a model, with the goal of resolving a problem of incompatibility between itself and the world. The psyche is not exclusively interior or exterior. It is a progressive individuation within the individual, constituted between the relation to world and others and the relation to self. This relation between self-world and self-self operates in the individual as individuation through affectivity and emotionality. Emotion operates the self-world and self-self relation. For Simondon, individuality is situated in affectivity and emotionality. This is different than other theories of the subject, which often rely on a theory of the subject's structure or a theory of consciousness. A subject is conceived as a substance or thinking consciousness. Spectrum of capacity-driven theories of subjectivation. Simondon conceptualizes living beings as existing on a spectrum, where the human-animal difference is one of level, not of nature. The notion of a spectrum accommodates different kinds of life or persons, where future versions of personhood could be mapped onto the continuum per the same parameter of differing by degree, like temperature, not nature, like geometry forms. Simondon's qualities of dynamism and process are present here too, as any placement on the spectrum is only metastable, ephemeral, based on the present snapshot moment of individuation, which is always expanding. This is a flexible structure that can include and productively organize different kinds of future beings, whether determined by personhood, intelligence, augmentation, or other parameters. The notion of an individuation spectrum, based on both pre-individual capacity for individuation and realized individuations by type and number, motivates a definition and understanding of future personhood based on capacity for individuation. Different instantiations of future persons could have different levels of capacity for individuation. Levels of capacity for individuation could be the simple organizing parameter for a potential society of diverse future persons. The framework of degrees of capability for individuation is extensible. It could also be multidimensional, as future persons may evolve capacity for other types of individuation beyond Simondon's psychic and collective individuations. Spinoza also has a capacity-driven theory of subjectivation, where the subject is defined on the basis of the capacity to affect and be affected. The difference between having an internal sense of freedom and slavery is the difference between affects that either increase or decrease a subject's power of action. To Spinoza, consciousness does not indicate a stable autonomous entity with free will. Rather, consciousness is a property that varies as a function of the overall sum of forces between active and passive affects within the subject. So there are similar themes in Spinoza and Simondon. First, subjectivation is based on capacity, where the subject is dynamically situated on a spectrum of capacity for individuation, affect, or power of action. And second, the subject is in a collective context. More broadly, Spinoza, living 1632 to 1677, is important as one of the strongest alternatives to Descartes, living 1596 to 1650, and the persistent Cartesian hold on thinking through mind-body dualism. For Descartes, sentient man was an exception, the famous cogito, I think, therefore I am. And mind and body are composed of two different substances, ergo the mind-body dualism. Spinoza, on the other hand, in Ethics, proposes the notion of a universal substance that emanates both body and mind, which are in different modes, but not fundamentally different. In Spinoza's reality, the physical and mental worlds are interconnected and derived from the same substance. This means that sentient man is not an exception, and therefore many kinds of persons could potentially exist as different formulations of the universal substance on the spectrum of having capacity for action. The Spinozist view robustly supports a spectrum of diverse future persons. Anxiety. The subject discovers that it exceeds its individuality. For Simondon, the idea of unrealized pre-individual potential is crucial. We are more than individuals. Our being is not reducible to our already realized individuated being, since as subjects we are constituted by ongoing but already realized individuations and the pre-individual potential for new individuation. Since the subject is both individual and more than individual, it means that it is incompatible with itself. Anxiety is the experience of the individual discovering this incompatibility that has within it that which exceeds it. This could sound deeply hopeful and liberating. The fact that such potentiality is a fundamental constitutive dimension of the subject. However, the lived experience of this can be a hideous conflict. The tension can only be resolved within the collective, not the solitary subject, because the solution would be to individuate all the remaining pre-individual potential at once, which would be death. In some sense, then, anxiety is the highest achievement that a being on its own can attain as a subject, since it promulgates action taking by the subject toward the collective and results in individuation. The collective is required for the individuation of the individual. In the absence of any possible encounter with others, the one who discovers itself to be a subject strives desperately to resolve within it that which exceeds its individuality, but it is an attempt bound to fail. We cannot show any more clearly how subjectivity cannot contain itself within the limits of the individual. The link to the collective through the trans-individual relation is therefore how the individuated pre-individual tension can be resolved. Simondon's collective and trans-individual disindividuation. An important dimension of Simondon's work that is of interest to social and political theorists and beyond is the link between the individual and the collective, which he understands at the fundamental level through individuation. Assuming that future persons would be within some sort of society, Simondon's conceptualization is applicable to developing an understanding of the collective context. Articulating the collective in more detail, Simondon thinks that functional social relations can be an obstacle to discovery and effectuation of pre-individual potential. What is needed is an exceptional disindividuation. What is needed is an exceptional disindividuating event to strip a subject of its usual social function and reveal its pre-individual potential to others. A classic example of this is in Nietzsche, where Zarathustra sees a tightrope walker fall and die. This is a jolt out of the rope walker's usual social role as a performer, which allows Zarathustra to see the rope walker's pre-individual potential, and through that, his own pre-individual potential. An observer of an event sees the pre-individual potential in the other at the moment of the shift in functional social relations, which causes the subject to become aware of its own pre-individual potential, and thus become engaged in the ordeal called forth by this discovery. This process disindividuates the subject. The transindividual disindividuation process loosens the subject's continued individuality, which is engulfed by the pre-individual, and conditions a new individuation. The break with functional social relations is important not only to abruptly show the other in a non-usual role, but also to strip the sense of one's own belonging to a social community so that an ordeal of trans-individuality through solitude for self-constitution can be effectuated. Regarding origination, individuation cannot be volitional. It occurs through unforeseeable events that are provoked externally. The failure of the functional relation to the other cannot lie in a voluntary decision by the subject. Through the disindividuation of the other, the subject is able to appear to itself as a subject and capable of having a relation to itself. Notably, it is the other, an exteriority, that provokes the relation to the self, not an internal process that produces the self-self relation. The other, not the self, is required for the self to have a full relation to self. How this happens is that when the other is no longer encountered on the basis of its usual function, it becomes that which puts the subject into question, forcing the subject to no longer perceive itself through the intersubjective representations of sociality, but nakedly as pre-individual potential. This is the sense in which the presence of the collective is already within the subject. It is in the subject in the form of unstructured pre-individual potential, and constitutes a condition for the relation of the subject to itself. The trans-individual subject